Welcome to Challenging Conversations, a podcast designed to help you engage in controversial topics with a biblical worldview. Let me ask you, what do you know about Islam? Do you have any Muslim friends? If so, how do you approach the topic of faith and religion with them? Today, we're diving into one of the world's most talked about and often misunderstood religions. Islam ranks as the world's second largest religion, exerting significant cultural and spiritual influence. Yet numerous Christians have so many questions and misconceptions about it. In this episode, we're joined by Christian apologist Alan Shlemon from Stand to Reason, who has spent over 2 decades studying Islam, training believers, and traveling to the Middle East to build bridges of understanding. Alan will help us explore Islam's allure, uncover some of its beliefs, and learn what Muslims believe about Jesus and Christianity. Get ready to gain a clearer understanding of Islam and learn how you can share the gospel of Jesus Christ with Muslims. Alan, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, I'm looking forward to our conversation, Jason.
Now, let me just tell the audience that we have known each other for many years through Summit, through Stand to Reason. We travel together, we know our families, we've seen our kids grow up. So it's an honor and a blessing, obviously, just to work alongside of you. But one of the things that I've always admired and why I've been wanting for a long time for you to come on is just how you're very passionate about Muslims and just your ministry. So right off the bat, I wanted you to just kind of lay the groundwork first about your personal endeavor in this area and what that looks like for you before we start diving into particulars, because I really want people to understand that this isn't just, oh, I went to seminar and I studied some of this, and I'm just kind of giving these lectures and sharing people about, the bullet points about Islam. This is something that's very near and dear to your heart. So why don't you tell us how you got started in, kind of looking into this religion and how you're ministering to Muslims all over the world?
Yeah, so shortly after I joined Stand to Reason, Greg Kokel and others were kind of like, we need somebody to kind of specialize on the topic of Islam. It was a post 9/11 world. Islam was like now on the radar of everybody. And so they thought to themselves, oh, hey, well, why don't we have you do it, Alan? Because after all, you're Middle Eastern. So I'm 100% ethnically Assyrian. And my family immigrated from Iraq. Now, we were never Muslims. The Assyrian people are generally Christians. And so it's not that I'm a former Muslim in any way like that. But because my parents came from the Middle East and we have family still in the Middle East, they thought to themselves, hey, well, you probably would understand the world of Islam better than any one of us if you were to kind of take upon it yourself to kind of study that topic. So they encouraged me to kind of focus on Islam. So I was studying at Biola for my Christian apologetics degree at the time, and I decided to take some extra electives to learn a little bit more about Islam and focus on that. So that's kind of what got me started. And then, I just started going to places here in Southern California where I knew there were large populations of Muslims and started, engaging Muslims kind of on the street, if you will. And then since then, I've been going to the Middle East every year, just about every year, for, I don't know, like 12 or so years now. And specifically, I train Arab Christians in theology and hermeneutics and apologetics. And because these Arab Christians live typically in a country that is dominated by Islam, they are regularly interacting with Muslims. And so we go over different kinds of tactics of engagement. And what's interesting is that a lot of Christians in the Middle East, they understand Islam, of course, but they don't study Islam formally too often. And so oftentimes, even though they might know what it's like to interact with Muslims because they have to all the time at work and in their neighborhoods and stuff, they don't have necessarily a tremendous amount of knowledge about Islam proper. And so because I've done a little bit more study on it, sometimes I'm able to give them some knowledge about that. And then we specifically talk about tactics of engagement. And then the other thing I do in the States is I'll often engage with, or I'll often train high schoolers or Christian youth, or sometimes even adults, and we'll go to mosques here in the United States. And I've been probably doing that for about a decade as well, where we'll go to a mosque, observe their service, and then we invite usually like a scholar or somebody who's at the mosque there, the imam, to give us a presentation, maybe, encourage us to become Muslim, give us like kind of your best case argument. And then the students that I've trained, on how to engage Muslims will then push back, ask questions, and so we have these really good dialogues. So I've been doing that for about a little bit over a decade, and a lot of these places are the same places we go back over and over because we've just built such a great relationship.
Wow.
So this isn't like really rude or ungracious kinds of engagement. It's like very civil discourse. The Muslims love it, the Christians love it, and we're having a great time in those conversations.
And I love hearing that. And you've shared some stories about that. And maybe, in the episode, we can touch on some of those down the road. But at this point, it does bring up like this issue where I like to know, like, how do you see the interest in when you're actually taking students? I mean, obviously they're participating like in a very integrated Christian perspective and touching on some stuff. So it's not just textbook, but it's also going out there in the culture and, engaging and talking and being respectful and having this dialogue, which obviously this is why we do the show, because we need to have these challenging conversations, but to do it with, truth and love. And so what a powerful way to demonstrate not just you doing it, but they can interact with people that have two different opposing worldviews. So have you seen that the interest has really, kind of grown when you are taking students and just the average Christian into those environments? And if so, why should we be more interested now than ever before in engaging Muslims?
Yeah, I find students and other adult believers get very interested, partly because I think there's this perspective like, oh, what is Islam? Like it's kind of a mysterious religion. People always see mosques, but they wonder like what's behind the doors of that mosque. They see women who might be covered, who cover their bodies and their face with a burqa or with cover their hair with a hijab, and there's kind of like this mystery behind it. And so when I say, hey, let's go to Muslims and talk to them, let's go to the mosque, let's go inside, let's walk around, let's observe what they do in their services, I think people are super fascinated about that. So I do find them very, very interested in it. And one of the things that I typically do before we go to the mosque is I'll role play a Muslim. So I'll put on some Muslim garb, and introduce my name as like Sa'id ibn Umar or something like that. And then I'll just kind of role play. So they kind of give them a feel for what it's like to interact with a Muslim. So they kind of get their nerves a little bit more settled, become a little more familiar with what they're going to expect. So it's not such a shock because it is very different. It's not like going to a church. I mean, yes, it's a building and yes, there's lots of people there, but it has a very different, almost, ominous kind of feeling when you're hearing the Muslim prayers and you're watching them prostrate themselves. And it's different. And so I find, though, that virtually everybody comes back super fascinated and super interested in talking to Muslims after that. Now, the other thing to consider is, and you were kind of asking about this, like, well, why should people be more interested in it now? And that is because Islam is increasing. The number of Muslims in the world is rapidly increasing. And I think, I don't know if you had mentioned this in some of your notes, but we estimate there's probably almost around 2 billion Muslims, which means that's like, if you consider the population of the world, that means it's almost like 1 in 4 people on the planet is a Muslim. I mean, that's a lot of Muslims. So they're rapidly approaching. I mean, if we estimate Christians to be about 2.3 billion, they're rapidly approaching the number of Christians around the world. So it could be very well be that at some point the number of Muslims would overtake the number of Christians. Now, I'm not saying that to like freak people out or anything, but what I am saying is there are lots of Muslims, and a lot of Muslims have now come to the States. And so you don't have to cross the Atlantic or cross the Pacific or go like internationally in order to engage Muslims. They're typically in your neighborhoods. They're typically in your cities and your communities. So we have this opportunity to talk to Muslims because they're just everywhere. And kind of the thing that makes it really easy is that Muslims are very comfortable talking about religion.
That's right.
They're very comfortable talking about God and Jesus and the Bible. In fact, I remember when I first started witnessing to Muslims, I drove to this neighborhood that I knew had a high Muslim population. And it was like a strip mall. There's some stores and some restaurants, and there was like Arabic font kind of in the names of these restaurants. I saw these two guys that were probably in their 20s, had a dark complexion. So I thought to myself, they're probably Muslims, right? And so I approached them. I said, "Excuse me, are you guys Muslims?" They were just about to go into this restaurant. And they said, "Yes, we are." He said, "Hey, great." I go, "Can I talk to you about God and Jesus in the Bible? Would you be willing to discuss that?" And they're like, "Sure."
Yeah,
So they
yeah,
invite me inside.
yeah,
We go and sit in this restaurant. And for 2 hours,
yeah.
we eat and talk about God and Jesus and the Bible. And the time just flew by. And I thought to myself, oh man, it's been 2 hours. My wife's probably wondering, like, what happened to me? Like, is Alan been shot? Is he dead?
Yeah.
So I tell these guys, I go, look, I've had a great time, but I got to get going. Let me pay for my part of the food that I ordered. And as I reached into my wallet to grab some money, they stopped me and they're like, no, 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 stop it. Put away your money. We insist on paying for your part of the meal. Now, I want you to contrast that experience with what would have happened had I gone to just a mall here in the United States, walked up to two average Americans and said to them, "Excuse me, I'm a Christian. Would you like to talk about God and Jesus in the Bible?" You know, they would say, "No way. Like, forget it. Like, get lost, creep. Like, we don't want to talk about Jesus." But for a Muslim, starting a conversation about religion is like starting a conversation about, SpaceX or Tesla with Elon Musk,
Hmm.
right? It's
Yeah.
virtually effortless. You just start the conversation and it goes. So the combination of having, 2 billion Muslims worldwide and them generally being very open to talking about religion and God and Jesus, to me is like a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to engage a massive group of people who we can very easily bring up the subject of Jesus and the gospel.
Yeah. I like that you said that because I found the same to be true. Obviously, you have way more experience and even just like you said, culturally being invested in the Middle East. But I oftentimes tell people when they have a Muslim friend, they're asking like, how do I reach them, whatever. I say, sometimes, most of the time, I should say, it's easier to engage with a Muslim than maybe an atheist friend or somebody who's progressive,
Mhm. Mhm.
And like you said, they relationally, and I'm not surprised that they paid for your meal. I had recently a guy who was in the military, American, but his family's from the Middle East, and he has the Muslim faith, and he was open, to Christianity, and we never, and I don't look to argue, you don't look to argue. We could debate openly, respectfully, but
Sure.
so we had a cordial relationship. I met him actually at the gym a while ago, and we just one thing led to another. Just like, hey, if you ever there's a great Middle Eastern restaurant in Charlotte. If you ever want to go, I said, you know what,
Right.
I would love that. He got there
Yeah.
before I showed up. He had already ordered the food before I showed up, and again, he was just being very hospitable.
Right.
The
Right. Right.
meal was already paid for, and he just wanted to have that time together. And the other thing too, to your point, like I know you were kind of like just walking up to them, but in something like that with me, I knew that I had to spend at least 2 to 3 hours with him. You know what I mean? And just had that time where I wasn't rushed. Like, because Americans, we just
Right.
rush to the next thing. We're like, I got to go. You know what I mean? And they really open their home. They want, they walk you out of their home. They're very, they're just very hospitable. So I want people to know, as you and I are going to dive into some of the specifics right now, is not to be alarmed. Don't be afraid. Like you said, the vast majority of people listening or watching, you have a Muslim friend or family member. You have somebody in your school, in your work, wherever it may be in your
Mhm.
neighborhood, and God wants you to love that person. And just like Alan said, you guys, it's actually not that difficult. Okay, so let's now dive into some specifics. So we're preparing the heart and mind of Christians who are watching, listening. So the first thing we want to do, obviously, because there's a lot of misconception, and I know that a lot of Christians are biblically literate. We don't say that to put them down, but they don't even know a lot of what we believe as Christians. They kind of they have like the basics. So sometimes it's important for us to understand the fundamentals. So I know sometimes the structure can be confusing to people, but what I want you to do, we'll start with the 6 articles of faith. What are those 6 articles that Muslims believe? And then we'll build into what most people know about, or they're known as the 5 pillars. Now, obviously, they feed
Right.
off each other, but why
Mhm.
don't you start with those? What are the 6 articles, and then transition into the 5 pillars and help us understand what those beliefs are, and then again, how a Muslim lives those beliefs and those pillars out in their daily life.
Yeah. So the six are so the articles of faith and the pillars are required beliefs and required behaviors for Muslims. So the required beliefs are the 6 articles. The first one is the most important one. Muslims are required to believe in what's called the unity of God. And in Arabic, this is called Tawheed. So this is the belief that there is only one God, and this one God exists as one person. So as you can see, that's a clear rejection of the Trinity, right? They vigorously reject the idea there can be 3 persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, who coexist as one God. So in Islam, that first article of faith, the belief in one God, is the foundational and most important theological concept in Islam. And so if you were to violate that doctrine, if you were to attribute divinity to something or someone other than Allah, you are committing the most grievous sin in Islam. It's called the sin of shirk. It's an unpardonable sin. And if you violate that violate that doctrine and commit that sin, you're guaranteed to go to hell, right? Do not pass go, do not collect 200, go straight to hell kind of thing, right? So anyway, so that first article of faith is the most important one, belief in one God. The other required belief is, or number 2 would be belief in God's angels. So they believe that Allah has created angels. They don't have free will. They just administrate God's kingdom. And 2 angels follow each and every person throughout their whole life, keeping track of your good and bad deeds, right? Another required belief is the belief in God's prophets. They would say that every human civilization has had a human who has been commissioned to be a prophet in their time and in their era. So, the Jews, the Christians, the Chinese, like every people group has had someone who's been commissioned to be a prophet who proclaims the truth of Allah, and oftentimes will also receive revelation from Allah, which they will then pass on to those people. And what's interesting about this doctrine is that a lot of people in the Bible are identified as prophets of Allah. So like David, Moses, Abraham, Jonah, and even Jesus are all identified as prophets of Allah. Another required belief in Islam is the belief in God's books. So the Quran says that a lot of these prophets have been given divine revelation to pass on to the people group that they are speaking to. And the Quran doesn't name them all, but the 3 that it does name, the 4 that it does name are, number 1, the Quran. So of course the Quran refers to itself as a divine revelation from Allah given to the Prophet Muhammad, they would say. And then there's also the Torah. So the first 5 books of the Old Testament are identified as a divine revelation from Allah given to the Prophet Moses. They believe the Psalms are a divine revelation given to the Prophet David. And then the Gospel is also identified and named in the Quran as a revelation from Allah given to the Prophet Jesus. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to say about that, but I'll just stop there and we can get into some details as to what that actually means. But that's another required belief in Islam. And then belief in the final judgment. So Muslims believe that at the end of time, every human being will be resurrected and they will be judged according to their deeds. And so all your good and bad deeds, which those 2 angels that have been kind of like stalking you your whole life, right, and keeping track of all your good and bad deeds, they'll bring all those good and bad deeds and put them on a scale. And if the good deeds outweigh the bad deeds, you go to heaven. If the bad deeds outweigh the good deeds, you go to hell. So they have a meritorious-based system of salvation. And then the other required belief in Islam is the belief in divine destiny, which is kind of this idea that everything that happens in the universe is according to the divine decree of Allah. So nothing, if God wills it, it'll happen.
Yeah.
So those are the 6 articles of faith.
Well,
I don't know if you want to keep going with the pillars or.
Yeah, I want to touch on, like, expound a little bit, not in great detail, because I'd love to have you come back on where we can just talk about how do you share the Gospels, talk about the Gospels with Muslims, because with other ministries that we've partnered with through the years, we publish, sometimes in Arabic, the Gospels or the Injils, and hand it to them, and I've never had one person refuse it. They've all taken it, and it's a great opportunity to start these type of conversations with them. But just what like that's shocking for a lot of Christians to understand. Like what you just said is, wait a second, they've heard that Jesus to them is a prophet, and we'll talk about that a little bit in more detail in a minute. But they believe in the Gospels, and don't the Gospels clearly teach that Jesus is God? So how can they believe in
Right.
something that clearly goes against what they believe, that he's just a prophet?
Yeah, that is huge. So the question is, yeah, how does the Muslim reconcile the fact that the Quran, which by the way is the highest authority in Islam, the Quran says that the gospel is a true revelation from
I
Allah.
know, exactly.
And the answer is that virtually every Muslim on the planet, not all, but virtually everyone, will say that although the gospel is a revelation from Allah, it has since been corrupted. It was either intentionally changed by the Christians,
Mm-hmm.
or as a result of their irresponsibility, they allowed it to become corrupted. And they would say the same thing, by the way, about the Torah and the Psalms as well. Like the Jews and
Yeah.
Christians either, you know, changed it intentionally or they allowed it to become corrupted. And that allows them then to no longer have to consider the gospel or Torah and Psalms as an authority. And so that's kind of how they get around it, because as you mentioned, the gospel teaches that Jesus claimed to be God, right, and was God, and died, was crucified and rose again. Which, of course, these are all things that Muslims deny.
Yeah.
So the way they get around it is and this is a cultural belief that virtually every Muslim will say, well, the Bible is corrupted. And when I say Bible, I mean Torah, Psalms, and Gospel.
Yeah.
That really, by the way, is also the number one objection that Muslims will say to you. So, provided you're talking about the gospel or you're trying to share Jesus with them, the number one most common objection you'll ever get is that the Bible is corrupted.
Yeah.
So you have to have a tactic, hint, that will help you to respond to that objection, because otherwise you're stuck. Because at the end of the day, no matter what evangelistic technique you're going to use, at some point you want to tell them about the message of reconciliation from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, they're going to say that source of authority is corrupted. So they're going to, cut you off right there, and now you're stuck. So at some point you're going to have to address that objection.
Okay, very good. So what are the 5 pillars now of Islam?
The 5 pillars are required behaviors. These are things that every Muslim must do. The first one is called the Shahada, or reciting the creed. And this creed is simply a confessional statement. It says there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, or Muhammad is his messenger. And in actuality, if you wanted to become a Muslim, all you have to do is say that creed, and of course, sincerely believe it, and you'll have started your journey as a Muslim. Okay. So, in fact, sometimes when we're at a mosque, they'll invite a member of their community to come up to the front of the mosque, and they'll recite that creed in Arabic, and then everybody will be like, woo, and applaud and cheer, because now that person's kind of started their journey as a Muslim. So recite the creed. Now, another required behavior, another pillar, is daily prayer. So Muslims are supposed to pray 5 times a day. So sunrise, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and then just before they go to bed. And then on Fridays, they have a more extended period of prayer, which oftentimes they're encouraged to come to a mosque to do that prayer, which is why we usually go on Fridays, because there's more Muslims there. So required prayer is another one. Another required behavior is the fast of Ramadan. So the fast of Ramadan is a 1-month-long fast where they have to abstain from eating, drinking, smoking, and sex during the daylight hours of that month. So before sunrise and after sunset, they can engage in all that, but during the daylight hours, they're supposed to abstain from it. And the purpose of that fast is to commemorate Muhammad receiving the Quran. So they believe that between 610 and 632 AD, the angel Gabriel appeared to Muhammad and told him to recite these words, and those words were the words of the Quran. So that's the purpose of that fast. And then another required behavior is to give alms. Muslims are supposed to give about 2.5% of their savings towards the needy or to the poor. And it can't be to a hospital or to an institution or to a charity. It has to be to individuals, and it can't be to people in the mosque or part of the Islamic community. It has to be somebody outside of that. And then the fifth pillar, the fifth required behavior, is the pilgrimage, or it's called the Hajj. And this is a requirement that every Muslim must do at least once in their lifetime. They must travel to Mecca, to Saudi Arabia, and perform a number of different rituals over a period of about a week or so. And that is a huge deal. It's expensive. It's arduous. But if they complete it successfully, then they believe that Allah gets rid of all their sins. So if you remember, I was saying that as they live their life, these angels keep track of all your good and bad deeds. Well, if you are, say, 40 years old and you've accumulated good and bad deeds here, well, you perform the Hajj, and now all your bad deeds are gone. You still get to keep your good deeds, and then you start continuing to live your life. And so that's a huge deal, because now you have a huge advantage of, when you die, having more good deeds than bad deeds.
And that's usually when people can go like on YouTube or whatever, on social media, and they can see people who are going to the Hajj that year, and they're encircling right in Mecca.
Yes.
And what? So explain that a little bit. Like, what is that whole ritual there, where a lot of people just talk about the big black box looking, image thing? Like,
Yeah.
Describe that a little bit for our audience.
Yeah, so in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, there's a mosque. It's the most holy mosque in all of
Yep.
Islam, and kind of in the center of it is this thing called the Kaaba, which is like a 30-foot by 30-foot cube structure, which they would say that Allah sent down a meteorite to Earth, and it impacted the Earth at that location. And this is where some say Abraham was commissioned then to build this Kaaba, this structure. And wherever you are on Earth, you're supposed to face the Kaaba when you pray.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, they've taken that meteorite and stuck it in the corner of the Kaaba. And
Yeah.
so, as Muslims will circumambulate the Kaaba, they'll often try to touch it, or if they can't reach it, they'll point to it, because it's like a significant thing that Allah has sent. So the Hajj consists of, yes, going to the Kaaba and circumambulating it, but it also entails other kinds of rituals that are done elsewhere in and around Mecca. They have to go to this one location where they pick up stones and throw them, and this is to symbolize them throwing stones at Satan. And there's a whole bunch of different rituals, and it takes about a week, and it's very expensive, but because they have to pay for accommodation and flights and food and all the the clothes and stuff. So it's a big deal.
They all have to dress in white garments, right?
Yeah, and that's to symbolize that all people, no matter whether you're a banker or a trash man or a head of state, we are all like one and equal before Allah, basically.
Interesting. All right, you kind of touched on the Trinity. But I want to touch on that a little bit more, because here's the question then. What is, and again, using your brilliant tactics, Alan, how do you respond as a Christian to a Muslim? Again, they're totally engaged, they're interested. They may think we'll talk about the Gospels being corrupted, how we can respond to that in a minute. But let's start with the Trinity. How can you word it in such a way to teach them what we actually believe, that they can better understand, or maybe even share a story? I know you have several about when you've shared that with Muslims, for you to understand what we mean by Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
So in Islam, there is a tremendous amount of confusion about what the Trinity is. As well as a lot of straw man arguments about against the Trinity. So, and part of the reason, by the way, why there is a lot of confusion amongst Muslims about what the Trinity is because the Quran, I would argue, mistakes what the Trinity is. It describes it incorrectly. So, for example, Surah 5:116. So this is chapter 5, verse 116 of the Quran. It says, "Beware of the day when Allah will say, 'O Jesus, son of Mary, did you say to the people, take me and my mother as deities besides Allah?'" So what you have there is this implication that what the Quran is responding to is a belief that people had, that they thought Jesus and Mary were parts of the Trinity. Well, that's not what the Trinity is, right?
Right.
It's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Mary is not included in the Trinity, right? And there's another passage in the Quran, Surah. This is Surah 583. It says, "They do blaspheme who say Allah is one of three in a Trinity," right? And they're like, no, there's only one God except for Allah, right? So here you have another verse which seems to suggest that the Trinity is this belief that there is one God, Allah, and then there's two others as well. There's three gods. And so this is why many Muslims you talk to will try to say, well, you guys are polytheists. You believe in multiple gods. And we're like, no, we don't. Or they'll say, well, you guys worship Mary. We're like, we don't worship Mary. We don't believe that she is a deity, right? So part of the confusion that Muslims have stems from the fact that the Quran mistakes what the Trinity actually is. And so this is actually would contribute to an argument where you're going against the Quran if you wanted to argue against the Quran. It's like, well, if the Quran is really the word of Allah, the all-knowing God, you'd think that he would know what the Trinity was, right? So anyway, so that's part of the confusion. So part of what it takes to communicate or talk about the Trinity with a Muslim, I think, is number one, is to clarify, first of all, we don't believe in polytheism. We're not saying we believe in three gods. We believe there's only one God who coexists as three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So there's only one what, one divine being, and three whos. And so that kind of tries to alleviate the concern that we're believing in something that's contradictory, or that we're believing in something that entails three gods, right? And I would say that the most, my preferred strategy of how to communicate or make a case for the Trinity is simply to point them to the Gospels, where there are statements that, for example, Jesus makes, where he says, "I and the Father are one," or elsewhere where the Jews, it says, picked up stones to try to kill Jesus because he was making himself equal with God. And so I simply point to verses in the Gospels where there is this implication or clear reference to Jesus claiming to be God, which of course contribute. I mean, obviously that's not the entire Trinitarian position, because you'd have to make the case that the Holy Spirit is God as well. But at least you're making progress towards it. And the reason why I say we should encourage Christians to point to the Gospels is because, remember, the Quran, the highest authority in Islam, says that the Gospel is a true revelation from Allah. Okay, well then, hey, let's point Muslims to the Gospel, which is called, as you mentioned earlier, the Injil. Let's point Muslims to the Gospel and show where Jesus, who they revere as a prophet, is speaking in the Gospel, which is a true revelation from Allah, about the nature of his divinity. So that's the way I typically will go in terms of responding to a Muslim who's questioning about the Trinity. Say, hey, look, this is what the authority says.
That's good. And we will get pushback, obviously, but like you said, once you start explaining and you kind of know what the Quran teaches, like you said in Surah 5, and you can kind of show them, what the Gospels teach, what they hold to according to the Quran, that to be true. You start clarifying that we're not polytheists. Now, one point of clarification, though, for our audience, when a Muslim says that Allah is one, that's not the same as when we say the one true living God is one. So unpack that real quickly. When a Muslim's saying Allah is one, obviously they don't believe in the Trinity. Yeah. So what type of philosophical understanding of Allah being one is to the Muslim?
I'm not sure.
Like they're not deists, obviously, but they're like modalists, where are they just modalistic, where they're just believing in this one essence that's not a manifestation of him in any which way? Because when they're talking about oneness, it's not the same like echad when you're saying with Jesus saying I'm one, same nature, same essence. So when you look at the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4, that's not the same, right? What the Jews and Christians believe about Jesus, and because that a lot of times the confusion sometimes is, do the Jews believe the oneness of God the same way the Muslims believe about Allah being one? Because we already know that we're different as Christians.
Yeah, I see. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, when it comes to this doctrine of the oneness of God, which is Tawheed, it's just simply they're trying to establish this very rigid I guess it sounds redundant to say oneness. In other
Yeah.
words, there can't be any partners
Yeah.
or allies with Allah. So attributing divinity or any other kind of divine attribute to someone or something other than Allah is prohibited. So yeah, God exists as one divine substance who exists as one person,
Right.
and that's it.
But then
And
our
again,
job is, but then our job is to show them, like you were saying, and we're gonna get to that in a minute. Here's Christ, who is equal with God. Let's make the case, and then Holy
right,
Spirit. But it's important, like you said, is to clarify. Not that I recommend that the Trinity is the first thing that you want to debate, but if they bring it up, perhaps. But you want to clarify that we're not polytheists, but we also are defending the oneness of God as well. I think that's also important, but we don't believe necessarily, like you said, what they believe about the oneness of God versus what we believe about the oneness of God. Even like if you're engaging with a Jew, they don't believe that, they think we're tritheistic, an
sure,
Orthodox Jew,
right.
right? So that's important. Okay, so let's transition then, unpack a little bit more about Jesus, because like you said, he's one of the greatest prophets. The Muslims don't believe, there's no records that we have of him actually performing miracles that could be validated, but they do validate the fact that Jesus performed miracles. Like you said, they do deny his death and resurrection, but they hold to the Injil. So it's like, how are you able to engage with a Muslim, not just, like you said, defending the Trinity, but showing that Jesus was more than just a prophet, that he fulfilled Scripture, he lived a sinless life. Yes, in fact, he performed miracles because it points to him being the Son of God. What are some insights or best practices that you've discovered, Alan, to help us discuss Jesus Christ more clearly to a Muslim, for them to understand that he is the Messiah, the Son of the living God?
Yeah, so what you said is really important, and that is this contrast between what the Quran says about Jesus with what it says about Muhammad.
Mm-hmm.
So I typically just want to make sure that they're aware of that, because most Muslims don't read the Quran. And I'm not trying to be mean, but I've just found that most Muslims aren't studying the Quran or the Hadith and the Sunnah and these other documents. But as you mentioned, the Quran, which again is the highest authority in Islam, speaks, I would argue, more highly of Jesus than it does of Muhammad. Like you said, it says that he was born of the Virgin, he lived a sinless and perfect life. He's actually called the Messiah in the Quran. And at the end of Christ's, oh, but by the way, like you said, he was able to perform miracles, but not just any miracles. He was able to raise dead people
Yeah.
to life. So this is what the Quran attributes to Jesus. And at the end of Jesus's life, he was not killed, but taken up to be in the presence of Allah. And Jesus is also appointed to come back at the end of time, to usher in the end of days, to kill the Antichrist, to break all the crosses, and to kill all the pigs. So no more bacon at that point, which would be a big bummer, right?
Yeah.
But that's significant, because according to the Quran, there's no significant announcement of Muhammad's birth. He doesn't say he was sinless. It doesn't say he did miracles. And according to the Quran, Muhammad has been dead and buried in Saudi Arabia for the last 1400 years, and he's not coming back. So again, according to their highest authority, Jesus has a very highly established kind of position in Islamic theology. So what this tells us is that as Christians, we have tremendous freedom to talk about Jesus, and to who, of course, is the central figure in our faith. And so I want to encourage Christians, hey, if you're talking to a Muslim, it's totally fine to bring up Jesus and to talk about him. And many times when you hear a Muslim talk about Muhammad, they'll often say, peace be upon him. Mm-hmm. So they'll be talking about Muhammad, say, hey, we think that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a very spiritual man. They'll interject that. Well, I've found even that many Muslims now, when they're talking to me or to other Christians, they'll say, Jesus, peace be upon him,
Mm-hmm.
So they attribute a lot of value and reverence towards him. So I think Jesus is hugely significant for many reasons, but one of the reasons why is because I think that he plays a significant role. Well, of course, a significant role in salvation for anybody, but specifically, I try to explain it to Muslims in a way that I think they'll understand. And here's the question you're asking about best practices. Here's how I try to get to a conversation about Jesus in under 60 seconds. In other words, if you had just a short amount of time to talk to a Muslim and you're like, okay, how do I get to the gospel? How do I get to Jesus? Here's my preferred way. Okay. I ask a question, and here's the question. I say, are you 100% certain you're going to heaven? Now, notice I didn't say, are you confident or do you think you're going to heaven? I'm asking, are you 100% certain? And now remember, we already talked about this. According to their view of salvation, it's based on good and bad deeds, and whether you have more good deeds and more bad deeds, right? Now, what do you think every Muslim says to that question? It's always no. No, every Muslim's going to say, no, I don't have 100% certainty I'm going to heaven, right? And because they don't know what those angels are going to bring to that scale. So my quick follow-up question is, well, would you like to have 100% certainty? Now, at this point, they're either do want to have 100% certainty, or they're just kind of curious. What is this Christian going to say? You know? And so they say, sure, yeah, how could I have 100% certainty? Well, now you can tell them about Jesus, because what does Jesus offer? He offers certainty. How does he do that? And here's what's so key to understand why it's important to understand Islamic theology. Jesus addresses both sides of that Islamic scale. So think about this. Through Christ's death and resurrection, what does he do? He atones for our sin, which means he wipes away all of your bad deeds. In other words, that side of the scale that would normally hold all the weight of your bad deeds on that Islamic scale is now completely unweighted, right? But Christ doesn't just atone for sins. Christ imputes his righteousness, which means like his good deeds and his good credit is now, or his righteousness is credited to you. So now all of his good deeds are now put on the side of the scale that would normally hold all your good deeds. And so now that scale tips like perfectly in your favor with no bad deeds and all of Christ's righteousness on the good deeds side. That scale is tipped in the favor of the Muslim. And so this is why I think Jesus Christ is such good news for the Muslim, because the very thing that they're so concerned about, which is to have certainty that they can enter heaven and to please God, right, is accomplished in the work of Christ. So again, my approach is, how do I get to that? Are you 100% certain you're going to heaven? No. Would you like to have 100% certainty? Sure. Okay, well, let me tell you about what Jesus did.
Right.
And I like to point them, by the way, just to give you another tip here, to John 3:16 through 18. And so when they're saying, well, how can I have 100% certainty? I say, well, let's read what John 3:16 through 18 says. And the reason why I think that's a good passage is, number one, it's Jesus speaking, who they regard as a prophet. Number two, it's in the Gospels, which the Gospels identified as a true revelation from Allah. And number three, almost any Christian is going to remember that passage, right? Because every Christian remembers John 3:16. I would just say, just go a couple of extra verses, because I think Jesus nicely kind of fleshes out the nature of what he's saying about himself and the nature of salvation.
Yeah, very good.
So that to me is my kind of go-to way of getting to the gospel, getting to Jesus in a very short period of time, and talking about something that they're typically very comfortable talking about, which is the nature of the gospel, Jesus, salvation, and God.
So this has been fascinating, and definitely I think it's going to be a blessing to so many people, Alan, because we all have people we know that are Muslim. Maybe as a small percentage, but hey, if it's just that one person that you work with, that you can start having this dialogue, who the vast majority of times, like you said earlier, and I've even witnessed this in my own life, they are interested. They want to have those conversations. And by the way, that's about 80% of anybody even who have no religion affiliation as well. They are interested, right, if you genuinely have a relationship with them, and there's somebody that you like, and they want to get to know you better. So we got to keep that in mind, and not just keep allowing fear or doubt consume us and cripple us from being able to go out there and engage these people who want to have meaningful conversations. So we talked about the 6 articles that they believe. We talked about the pillars and how they live behaviorally out, in their prayers and their giving, etc. We saw some of the distinction to be made about the Trinity, understanding the Injil upholds Jesus, the revelation, and the gospel to be from Allah himself, so people can understand that, so get better acquainted in the gospels, share them
Right.
with your Muslim friends. But let's do this as we close out. So you have a neighbor who's a Muslim, and you've engaged, a little talk with them here and there. But then you're like, you know what? I really do want to get to understand what their faith is all about. Maybe they watched or listened to this podcast with us, right? And they're interested in diving further, and which is one reason why people sometimes click on things. You're like, oh, I want to learn more about this. And so
Sure.
we're coming to an end. What are at least, I don't know, 3 to 4 to 5 steps where, okay, I'm ready, Alan. I may not go to a mosque like you're taking students. I'm not there yet. But I do want to approach my Muslim friend in my neighborhood. Let's just say, let's start there. What can you offer practically and wisely for me to do that?
Well, I think that Muslims typically are a very relational people group. They come from, not all, but many come, if they come from the Middle East or other collectivistic kinds of cultures, they're very relational, and they value, they come from an honor shame kind of society. And so typically they're very open and welcoming of relationships. And so if you have Muslims in the neighborhood, or you have a classmate or coworker, I think building relationships is a huge deal, because relationships function like a bridge by which trust is built, and where you can share truth and share the gospel. So I think the degree to which you can be able to share the truth in the gospel will be a function of your relationship with that Muslim. So that'd be the first thing I'd say is to do that. Just start a conversation, start a relationship, be friendly. Bring them over something that maybe you've prepared. Hopefully not pork products and no
Yeah,
alcohol. So
right.
you got to be mindful of some of those things. But again, I think that most of the situations where we've initiated conversations or relationships with Muslims, they're very open to it, and they're welcoming of it. And once you've now established a relationship, you have now a platform. Not that they're just gospel fodder, but because they're valuable in and of themselves. But
Yeah.
once you have a relationship, that can be like a platform to eventually springboard into more profound and deeper conversations about religious matters, which again they're typically very comfortable with.
Awesome. Yeah. And
I think though that, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if we were going to mention just that key objection that,
I was actually going to, I was going
know.
to jump on that, because one thing is,
Oh,
let's say they're in this setting and they bring that up. What is, again, a tactic that they could use to kind of, again, not be argumentative, but bring it back in a way to show them that those are not proper objections, whether it be the corruption of the Bible, etc.
Yeah, because so the strategy that I was kind of unpacking earlier, where I say, well, point them to John 3:16 through 18, or tell them about the Trinity from the gospel. Although that's sort of my initial thing, the most likely response you're going to get is like to say, well, that's corrupted, right? And if you don't address that, you're in trouble. What's ironic about the situation is that although Muslims claim the Bible, or specifically the gospel, which is the revelation that I think is the most significant for our purposes, although they claim the gospel is corrupted, the Quran, which is their highest authority, does not teach it's corrupted at all. In fact, it teaches the opposite, that the gospel is a true revelation from Allah that is uncorrupted. And so what I often do is point them back to their own Quran.
Yep.
To demonstrate that their highest authority views the gospel in a very significant way. And there's 3 things the Quran affirms. Number 1, the Quran affirms that the gospel is a divine revelation from Allah. Number 2, the Quran affirms that the gospel was available to be read in Muhammad's day. And the third thing that the Quran teaches is that the gospel is authoritative, which means it must be believed and obeyed. Now think of think of the implication then. If the Quran says that the gospel must be believed and obeyed, it must believe that the gospel is not corrupted. Otherwise, why would Allah command people to believe and obey a corrupted text?
Right.
And when I say those three things that the Quran affirms, I'm not suggesting that this is derived from some single obscure verse in the Quran. This is the overwhelming majority of what the Quran teaches. There are dozens of passages that affirm the divine revelation of the gospel that is available in Muhammad's day, and that it's authoritative to be believed and obeyed. And so when I use that strategy of saying, hey, would you like to have 100% certainty that you're going to heaven? And I point to the gospel. If they bring up that objection, oh, the gospel's corrupted, then I use that tactic to leverage their commitment to the Quran to my advantage. And then once I've eliminated that objection that the gospel is corrupted, then I go back to teaching about the gospel and Jesus from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah.
And this is significant because in Islam, whatever the Quran affirms, Muslims must affirm.
Yeah.
And since the Quran affirms the gospel is trustworthy and uncorrupted, then Muslims must also affirm that.
Yeah.
So that's a key tactic. And I talk a lot about it in on our website, str.org, and elsewhere. But I think just knowing some of those verses and just becoming familiar with that key tactic will help you, because that's the number one objection you're going to get. And you've got to address it in order to be able to have the freedom to tell about Jesus from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So good, Alan. I really appreciate just your wisdom and the insight, and to really challenge our listeners to know that this is an opportunity that we have to engage the people around us. And in this case, this is a fast growing religion. Like you said, it's already over 2 billion. If there's 8 billion people, so to speak, in this world, like you said, 1 out of 4, if you will, are Muslim. And so this is an opportunity for Christians to dive right in there. So appreciate you coming on, man. I appreciate you and all the work you're doing, and thank you for the wisdom that you shared today on today's podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jason. I appreciate it.
Well, my friends, I want to tell you guys that what Alan had shared with us today, there's so much more, and I definitely want to have him come back on so we can look at some of these specifics when it deals with the corruption of the Bible. But for now, like Alan said, you can go to str.org and you can check out all the resources that they've been putting together for years. I myself have been enriched and personally blessed by a lot of the resources that Alan and his colleagues there have put together. Published works, video curriculum, and tons of great articles that can help you tactically, winsomely, and respectfully engage Muslims and other people of different walks of life with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you guys for watching. Leave us a comment wherever you get these podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure that you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Till next time, keep having those challenging conversations. All right, brother.